How do we start this?
I'm Matthew Buckley Smith.
Welcome to SLEERICKETS. I'm not Matthew Buckley Smith. This is the third or fourth best poetry podcast out there, depending on who you
Mhm.
ask. If
Yep.
you ask me, it's sort of the third, maybe the second or the third.
There. Yep. After Commonplace and Breaking Forms.
Yeah, yeah. What
Um,
what what do we say then? We say thanks for listening. It's
yep.
it's it's good that you guys listen. I mean, if you didn't listen, we'd just be speaking to silence.
Yep. On
Yeah, thank you
pace
for
as usual.
thank you for some of you for subscribing to the secret show.
You
Someone
should know,
somewhere.
by the way, I should clarify, as my wife apparently did not know, it's not actually secret in the sense that, like, please do tell people about it. Like, she thought she wasn't allowed to tell people about it because it's secret. That is a that is not correct. Please do tell
No, no,
people
no.
about it.
Yes, we are a word of mouth podcast. So
Right.
spread
Yeah.
spread the news, spread the
Yeah,
happy
please
news, but
do.
only to cool people. Only to
I
only
think
to
at this
sort of.
point I'm happy expanding the audience too. I mean,
Oh, okay,
yeah, whoever
okay,
you whoever you would like.
right.
But please do actually tell somebody about it. Like, take, like, it,
Yeah.
like, I my goal is that people subscribe to the Secret Show because it's actually fun to listen to and not out of a sense of obligation. But I will accept obligation subscriptions as well. And if that's not for you, then maybe just take a moment to tell somebody that it's a show. It's the third best poetry podcast according to no less than Cameron Clark.
According to others, it's the fourth, but according to me, it's the third.
God damn it! All
Yes,
right.
yes, yes. We're prostituting ourselves to everyone now. So tell
Mhm.
all your friends, even the ones who, especially the ones who hate poetry. Yeah, tell them about
I
the
think
secret
that's I think
show.
that's an Elijah line. I think he has a line about people who hate poetry.
Oh, am I
Uh,
seeing from Elijah now? Oh,
yeah,
now
yeah.
I'm depressed.
We're just recording this all in a go. I'm going to try to chop it down to a tolerable length and quality, and then release it as soon as possible since it's already late as shit.
Maybe you
Uh,
shouldn't just. Maybe you should just release it raw without any editing. I won't. I mean, it would sound terrible, but it would be kind of amusing. It gives the fans like they'd be able to like peek behind the curtain to see what the real Slee Ricketts is like without all the about the artistic rendering downs.
yeah, I think it would just have a lot more silence and ums than they were used
Right.
to for the most part. Failed riffs, cancelable jokes, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All that.
Yeah, I think that's probably a sufficient intro. Do you
That was
want
a
to go
brilliant
ahead?
intro.
Oh, I mean, yes, that was a
The
great. Sorry,
best
I forgot
intro.
you were still signed on. It was a great intro, Cameron. Thank you so much. All right, just
Okay.
I have a very dumb point of business that I thought I would run by you to tell. So because I feel like you are younger and more enlightened than I am. Well, I know you're
Of course.
younger, and I feel like you're more enlightened than I am.
Of course.
Uh, so I heard this thing in the news. It's a very silly literary news story, and I had a very I had what I think is probably like a very Scrooge-ish response to it. So I want to preface it with a colossal disclaimer. So the colossal disclaimer being, I find Trump to be horrible and odious, and I don't wish him any further success or prominence. And I am at this point having witnessed his behavior in public on the greatest scale possible for a number of years. I find it very easy to believe any horrible accusation about him. I find it very easy to believe that he's done just about any horrible thing anybody mentions that he might have done. And so I have nothing but all of my legal and humanitarian sympathies are with the woman who's currently taking him to court, E. Jean Carroll, who's a writer. I'm inclined to be entirely on her side. There's just this one thing that happened in court that I found troubling in a very nerdy, very nitpicky literary way.
Okay.
So with all
Explain.
my sympathies on her side, this thing happened in court. So the Trump's lawyer tried to call her credibility as a witness into question by citing a memoir she wrote called "The What Do We Need Men For? A Modest Proposal." That was the name of her memoir. Now, I know as soon as you hear the subtitle of that memoir, immediately you have a pretty solid, obvious literary context for this title. Yeah. A modest
Yeah.
proposal.
Yeah.
This is the Swift essay. So I'm just going to read you a little section of the court transcript in which the Trump's lawyer is interrogating her. He
Okay.
says,
Read ahead.
yeah, okay. At one point, I think in your book, you propose we should dispose of all the men. She answers, into Montana. He says, into Montana? She says, yes, and retrain them. Trump's lawyer says, so retrain. So all the men here in this courtroom, in this country, all get shuffled off to Montana and get retrained. She says, you understand that that was said as a satire. Trump's lawyer, ah, okay. I feel like the transcript is probably not capturing the what I assume was an enormous pause in his response. The
Okay. Right.
the judge then interjected with his timeline is a little loose, but he says it comes from Jonathan Swift's immodest proposal 700 years ago, right? It's 300 years ago, but it was the 1700s, so I think that's what he meant.
Right.
Eugene Carroll says yes. The judge says let's move on. And Trump's lawyer says, "Thank you, Your Honor." Now he later Trump's lawyer, like first of all, like it's hilarious that Trump's lawyer didn't get like a high school freshman level literary reference. It's also hilarious that he later filed a motion for a mistrial because it was unfair of the judge to interject that it was a literary reference. So all of this is laughable. Trump's lawyer is exactly the buffoon one would expect. I just have this one extremely annoying quibble. And so like you can maybe offset the annoyingness of my quibble.
Quibble away.
All
I'm
right.
waiting.
So she wrote this book and I looked at the book. I read the first little section of it. It's a memoir. She talks about her own experience. She kind of goes on a road trip. She echoes Joan Didion, and then she has as a sort of a. I mean, most of the book seems to be an account of 20 really horrible men being like genuinely atrocious to her in sometimes funny ways, sometimes really appalling ways, sometimes violent ways, really, despicable stuff. And all of that, I think it was well received. It was well reviewed. It was, I gather, funny. I didn't read it. I'm not saying I gather sarcastically. I just haven't read it. But it's, I think the tone is fairly obvious from reading just a few sentences of it and even just from this account, right? In the book, among other things, she says, oh, well, what do we need men for? Maybe what we need to do is we need to take all men, send them to Montana to a training camp and re-educate them, get them to be less shitty to women, right? Like as an argument, as a treatment, as a spiel, this is all pretty clear. And like, it sounds like relatively sympathetic as an expression of like her personal frustration and experience with men over 75 years. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So
Okay, get to your
we're
point.
there.
You're circumscribing too much.
Yeah. Okay. It's just that a modest proposal is a genuine satire. It is responding to what Swift saw as the horrible mistreatment of the Irish by proposing that the Irish sell their own children as a food product to be cooked and eaten by the English upper class. And in that way, the Irish would be able to leverage themselves out of poverty because they would suddenly become the producers of a highly desired and expensive delicacy, that being their own children, right? Like this is an obviously horrifying proposal, but it is responding to, and the if memory serves from, my freshman year of high school, the end of the essay is Swift saying, well, obviously we can't do all these other things. And then he lists a bunch of actually reasonable responses to Irish poverty and mistreatment. He says, well, obviously we can't do all these other things. And so we have to go ahead with this selling and eating children plan. So it's a satire of poor treatment of the Irish by proposing horrifically, hilariously poor treatment of the Irish. This is proposing an obviously unserious, draconian treatment of men as a satire of men behaving badly. My quibble is that's not satire. That's hyperbole, right? Like satire is when, like, if this were satire, then the proposal would be send all women to a training camp to turn them into Stepford wives or something like this. Like it would be a more horrible exaggeration of the horrible qualities she's observing in men. Whereas this is just a sort of a sarcastic, hyperbolic response. I think she's right and the judge is right and everyone is right who's commented on this. That like, no, it's not. It's silly for the lawyer to take this as a serious threat or belief. But like, that's not what satire is. And what bothers me a little bit is this seems to be the same false understanding of satire that's behind like so much dumb right-wing comedy. Like when right-wing trolls post like fascist memes and then they say like, oh, but it's satire. I'm not really proposing that we throw Antifa into Auschwitz. I'm just it's an exaggeration. But that, like again, that's not satire. Like satire is when you exaggerate what is already bad in order to make it more obviously bad. Am I wrong? Or am I just a stick in the mud?
No, you're not wrong. I mean, you're obviously not wrong. I find it very hard for anyone to say that you're not wrong. I'm not sure what you're upset about though. Someone's written a book in some way of a parody of like a great piece of sort of genius of satire and have done it badly. What's the big
Oh
issue
yeah,
there?
I don't even really have like that she used. I mean, a modest proposal is super overused. Like that's got to be the subtitle of like 700 books at this point.
Right.
Yeah,
But I
it's
mean,
very overused.
obviously she's bad. Like, well, not obviously, but like she's bad at satire. I mean,
I mean,
this is true.
it
She's
may
misused
be a very
satire.
funny, but yeah, I think what bothers me is just that like it has been this like little moment has been commented on by a lot of news outlets, all of whom have said, "Ha ha ha, Trump's lawyer doesn't understand what satire is," and I just want to say like, well, what troubles me is like all of the people pointing and laughing at him and saying he doesn't understand what satire is, don't understand what satire is either. That nobody in this conversation seems to understand what satire is. Like satire
Yeah,
is a thing worth understanding.
yeah, but you're trifling with minnows. I mean, yeah, most of them don't understand what satire is. They're not
I mean,
great
this is
artists.
like
They're not great
NBC,
critics.
Esquire. These are like major publications and
Yeah, but
news outlets.
When did NBC and Esquire have like a good understanding of literature? Not at
Uh,
least for 50 years.
yeah, all right, maybe you're right. Okay, so
I mean, I
okay,
don't disagree with you. I just wouldn't care that much, or at least maybe it's my own arrogance. But I guess I'd feel a sense of superiority and then think, well, sort of the great writers and the great geniuses of our time, and the people who really, truly understand satire and are well read, are clearly not these people. And this is sort of middle brow commentary. So why does it matter that much?
yeah,
I'm just more dismissive of it than you. To an extent, you could argue that she is being satirical, but you'd have to say that she's being satirical to her own side and that she's satirizing some people's like extreme views of what we should do
right,
to reform masculinity. But
right.
I think it's not good
That's
satire.
clearly not.
It's
But that's
nice
clearly not what she's
hyperbole.
doing. Yeah, that's clearly
Yes,
not what
yeah.
she's doing. Yeah,
But
she's not doing a bit on feminazis, right? That's not her
yeah.
target. Yeah.
But
Uh,
you're trifling with minnows. You're trifling with minnows.
trifling. All right. As a Leviathan, I've demeaned myself by trifling with the likes of NBC, Esquire, CBS, and the Courthouse
I
News
mean,
Service.
you
The
one
Washington Post, the New York Times, the Daily Mail, the MSNBC. Yeah, sorry, I'm just like looking at all the people who've made a story out of this and didn't understand what satire was. But yeah, that's all right.
well, yeah, I guess like what you could argue is that we have a very debased understanding of many of the arts, which is true, and that's I'd blame that on the academy because the academy has become so insular that it's taken sort of the definitional power that used to be associated with all literary forms and placed it in sort of one solid context, and in some extent, it has taken that away from the people, so that on the outside sort of the middle brow presses and also groping after scraps of also the originary literary definitions. But you're not going to solve it. And I think your quibble, I just think you need to kind of dismiss it and build your own world of sort of, you can't truly live or like live inside the world of these presses, like of these of these journals of these newspapers,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
fundamentally that they are bad thinkers, and one cannot live with bad thinkers for long without going insane.
yeah. No, I mean that's probably true. Like Matt Wall sent me a video that was drove me a little bit crazy because it was a YouTube person who's like I guess a lowish tier YouTuber, but still has like 200,000 subscribers, and her whole shtick is she's a sassy progressive, and then it was a sassy send up of dumb right wingers, and like the right wingers were definitely dumb, but they were also like really small time. and she was also dumb in her like she was dumb and wrong in all of her commentary on how they were dumb and wrong, and the whole thing just made me feel like, fuck, like, god damn it. What is any of this?
Oh yes, but like that happens in all politics. I mean,
Yeah,
all
yeah.
our
Oh yeah, I
political
mean,
issues
sure,
are
yeah,
just that. They're just that. They're just people being dumb and wrong about each other.
yeah.
The
All
left and
right.
the right.
Fair.
I'm disinterested. They disgust me.
Okay, so I did want to say a couple words about the Newburyport Poetry or Literary Festival. It's not just poetry that I went to, because I think it was lovely. It was, if anything, sort of too short. Like it was too dense. I think like in a perfect world, you would sort of be able to relax and spread it out over a couple more days. But it was lovely. It was great to see a lot of people at the reading. Were among others Rena Espaillat, Alan Shapiro, Andrew Hudgens, Aaron Pachigian, Amit Majmudar, a ton of powwow poet people. Didn't know all of them, but I got to know some of them. Anton Yakovlev, I think, is a giant, gentle Russian man who writes smart poetry. Zara was there, who was I didn't realize like she was truly heroic and just like managing the egos of like 24 poets. I mean, if her whole job was just managing Ahmed and me, then that would have been more than enough for one person. But she really did a lovely job and could not have been nicer or more welcoming. Newburyport is very fancy.
But I mean, how was Puchidian and Ahmet Mujmedar there? I'm trying to refrain from making comments that will get people upset with me.
Yeah, particularly because Aaron is now going to start listening to the podcast for the first time. So God only knows
Oh,
which episodes he'll find.
oh,
But yeah, I mean, yeah, they were quite good. Like, I mean, I think like both of them are very good at giving performances in a way. I actually thought like overall, I was bracing for a. I mean, I think any poetry reading I go to, totally independent of the quality of the writing, I worry about what it's going to be like. This was too. I mean, it's too much all in a row. It's 8 hours of poetry in a row. But I actually thought like people were better at reading than I was used to or than I remembered. I didn't hear any of what sounded to my ears like poetry voice. And there were a fair number of people who seemed to have a real sense of presentation and had some, I don't know, like style. Like Alan Shapiro, I was there and I had dinner with him and his wife afterward, and he was like commenting on the different styles of readers, and I thought like, well, just that you could identify different styles of readers, whether or not any of them was your favorite. Like I thought that's saying something. Like that's saying at least more than I would have said for just about any poetry reading I went to, 20 years ago.
mm-hmm.
So I yeah, like I was
Yeah.
I was I appreciated that. So here is another extremely obnoxious observation that I will separate entirely from the quality of the writing, because I think it actually had nothing to do with the quality of the writing on either end. But I did think that they were I mean, they're probably like 20 poets. So one other thing I think that they did that I thought was quite good, and I really wished that this was something more poetry readings had as just a matter of course, is like as part of what was just planned for the reading. Many of the readers got up there and they read. A lot of them were reading from anthologies, and so often they would read a poem that they had written or a translation that they had written, but then they would read several other poems by just like other poets who were either dead or were not there, or canonical poems. And I thought like that's quite lovely. Like, why wouldn't we have at poetry readings also reading good poems that you just like, or that are you have some other occasion to read and they're worth hearing? And here they are. I
I
thought
wish
like,
I wish like that was the opposite. I wish the
oh,
sentiment
you
was
wish
the
the
opposite.
opposite of that?
Yeah, I wish that I wish
You
that
wish
you
that
would be.
famous dead poets would come on and read the work of unknowns?
No, no. I mean, I wish that you were saying why at poetry readings do people read only other people's poems? Why don't they read their own occasionally? Because
You mean like you wish we
then
had the
the art
opposite?
form
You
would
wish
be
we had the
beautiful.
opposite problem. Yeah.
Yeah, it has then
Yeah,
it'd
yeah,
been a
yeah.
great thing.
Yeah,
You
no,
know,
no. So I mean, yeah, I totally thought that was very I was very glad for that. I have, as a matter of habit, I try to start my readings with some stuff by other people. But this was like this was baked in, so like a lot of the morning was like poets reading poems, but and like usually pretty good readers reading poems by dead. Some of them more famous poems, some of them were not as well known poems, but by celebrated poets. But yeah, I felt like that was quite good. And a similar thing happened with the final reading. The end of the final reading was a story by the first poet to be like really or sorry, not the first writer to be really celebrated by the festival, who was Andre Dubus Jr. So both father and son are famous writers, fiction writers, both named Andre Dubus. But Andre Dubus Jr., who was the older of the two writers, the final reading was a short story by him. I think it was a short story by him. I'm pretty sure, and it was read by a guy who does audiobook recordings. Like because I think the writer is dead, but this isn't a guy he's not a writer himself that I know of. He seemed to be, his job was he recorded audiobooks, and he had a great voice, and he just went up on stage and read this story. I thought like that like there you go.
Yeah, that's very good. That's
heartwarming. No, exactly. Like that's what should be happening. So I thought that was great. I was really glad for that, and it's not something I encountered often. Similarly, as I said, there was really no like conventional poetry voice to speak of, and neither did I notice any new forms of poetry voice that felt like they were becoming conventional. At least, like it didn't seem like there was a prevailing style of reading. So
there wasn't the performance poetry voice.
Well, so there was, if anything, Amit did a version of that with his final poem, which was a kind of a performance piece. He did something that could have like that piece could have been at home in a spoken word reading, though not like most of his poems he didn't read that way. And
Amit's the great prose writer. He's like Pope.
The great prose writer.
Yeah.
You mean he writes his verse essays?
Like yeah, he writes lovely metrical prose.
Oh my God, you and Elijah with these terms, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's my take on the arrogant argument. People are arrogant. People call him arrogant. I think he has a right to be arrogant because he has a real Popian skill, but I'm not sure it's a skill at poetry per se.
I mean, I think the verse narratives or the verse essays are different. I mean, I think he writes a couple different kinds of things. Like I think he has some really lovely lyrics that are not that. I think the verse essays are closer to prose. I don't think they work the same way prose works though. And he does. I mean, he tends to play with language more. I mean, I think it is closer to prose than some of his pure lyrics are. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's quite fair. But I would say like whether or not you like spoken word performance style, in doing that with his last long poem, that was by no means the norm. Like whether you like any of the individual styles or not, it didn't seem to be that there was the conventional way everybody was automatically doing it. There were just a bunch of different styles. Here's the obnoxious comment. And there's really more of a question because I think you can also, if I know some of the some listeners, I actually met a number of really wonderful listeners. Some I knew already, some I didn't. I'm trying to think. I'm going to try to pull up their names by memory, and if I forget anyone,
you met
apologize.
You met Jim Moonen, I think. Jim Moonen.
I met Jim Moonen.
He came. He messaged me afterwards and told me.
I met Jim. He was unbelievably nice. I was going to name people by first name only, but yeah, Jim Moonen, I think, and he's posted online about it. So yeah, he was really, really wonderful. By the way, the first time, and I've heard lots of people have told me, Brian's the best part of your podcast. You need to have more Brian. Or like, oh, Cameron's so great. I wish it were all just you and Cameron do it. Or, oh, Alice is wonderful. I had somebody at the festival told me the best part of the podcast was Joanna. They're like, Joanna's great. She's been on 2 fucking episodes, motherfucker. Like, what? Come on now. Is that just a back? Is that an insult? Like, what do you mean? What do you mean? But Jim Moonen is the first and only person who's ever told me that the best part of the podcast is me. So really extra points to Jim Moonen. Thank you so much. That was very sweet. But no, I met him. Yeah.
I'm surprised people have said they like me, but no, Jim Moonen is very nice.
Yeah, no, he was lovely, and he's a big fan of yours, both on the podcast and on the page. But I met Portia, I met Owen. Obviously Zara was there and did a lot. I mean, did a whole lot. while there. Alfred was really lovely. Al, who was interesting conversation. Saw Austin Allen, who was great, and a number of other, oh god, I can't remember everybody's name, but there some lovely people. There were also, just as a nice balance to the conservative Christians who I know listen to the show, and I'm grateful for their patronage, their attention, and their criticism at times. It was nice. Like, I met some people who were like, "Oh, I'm genderqueer. I'm a socialist." I'm like, so it's just nice to like meet some people who had some. It's not all conservatives listening. It may be.
Were they
I don't. Yeah.
denouncing? Did they just walk up to you and go, "Hello, I'm a
Hello, I'm
socialist"?
genderqueer. No,
Yeah.
no, it came up in conversation. I'm just nice saying like,
I guess I see the gender. I see the like them. I see sort of the non-binary coming up in conversation quite easily with pronouns.
Is that, by the
I'm
way,
slightly
is
confused.
that
Like,
because you're young? You're young though. Does genderqueer and non-binary, does that mean the same thing?
it may do. I'd have to ask the individual
I would
person what it
assume
meant.
genderqueer is like a broader category. I would assume than non-binary is
Well,
a specific,
maybe.
or is it?
Well, I mean, depends what pronouns they used.
Well, I don't even know what pronouns. I was just, somebody said.
Mm.
I think that he was, well. Sorry, I'm saying he. I don't know if he uses he. They
Let's
was
just say
saying
they
the
for it to be so.
they okay. So they were saying they were making a commentary about something else, and identifying themselves. There were a couple people I talked to. There were a couple of socialists, but was identifying themselves by saying, I'm, as a genderqueer socialist, blah blah blah. But it was not in. It was in regard to some other context where like that was an unusual thing, I think. But yeah, like the politics came up in a couple of conversations. But it was
Okay.
it was gratifying to know that I'm either, my goal is like either to alienate everyone or to alienate no one, but I don't want to alienate just one side.
Right.
Yeah.
But my friend, your obnoxious question. You must get the listeners want the listeners listen to
Yeah.
this for your obnoxious
Okay.
question.
At risk of insulting both of my female listeners, the men were stronger readers overall, not stronger writers.
Explain.
And in fairness, most of the people who read for longer, like the after lunch, there were most of the, well, actually at the right before lunch and then after the lunch break were most of the people who read for 20-25 minutes each rather than reading 5 minutes each. And most of the people who read longer were men. And so whether that means there was sort of more time or they were prepared for something longer or whatever that means, that probably skews my experience some and skews the selection. So certainly I can't say that this was all like a perfect random sampling of the population, but it did seem that overall the women were, I mean, for one thing, the women were harder to hear. Like a lot.
Women didn't know the women were worse at projecting.
Well, so there was a mic. It was not a great mic, and the acoustics in the room were not great. And in fairness to them, what you could maybe say is that somebody who is as deaf as I am, but a woman, might have had trouble in the other direction. So maybe that's purely all it is like I've heard, at least, whether it's true or not, that men's hearing falls out at the upper register first and women's falls out at the lower register. So it's possible that I was just able to hear the men better. But it did seem that the women were just a lot quieter. And it certainly was not that they were doing reading in a bad way. That was not the case. And it was not that their poetry was worse at all. It was just that it was harder to follow, harder to hear. And there were fewer, it seemed to me there were fewer choices happening. Like if you're going to get up and you're going to read, it seemed to me that there was less done in the way of saying like, here's what I'm going to read and here's how I'm going to try to grab you with it, or here's how I'm going to try to throw it into the room or make a choice about how to present it. It seemed more to me to be sort of automatic, quiet, calling out the words in order. And I don't know. Yeah. Like, so like, is that like there are a few possibilities. Like one is that it's just purely my bad hearing or like sexism. Like that's all it is. That accounts for the entire difference. Like another possibility is like weird sample and one instance doesn't mean anything, right?
Right, yeah, and I can't account for like
either of that. Yeah, who knows? Yeah,
there.
You weren't there.
But,
you don't know what any of this sounded like.
Two is maybe quite likely.
Made me wonder. Okay, like the feeling I had at the time was that it was not that there was any difference in talent. It was not that there was any difference in experience, right? Because there were some really senior and very excellent and experienced female poets there. But it seemed to me that this might be an instance of there being, you know, earned or not, a greater confidence or a greater willingness to assert oneself among the men. Like it seemed like the men were sort of making bold choices, or at least throwing themselves out there in a way that was at least easier for me to engage with. Now, I mean, what's possible is that there were other people who were really put off by that, and they found the sort of like the quieter rendering of the women less pretentious, and maybe they were just sort of able to follow the words easier. Again, a lot of it was volume for me. But yeah, I wondered, like, do you have thoughts about that or experience with any of that? Does that conflict with or jive with any of your own observations at readings? Am I just is this purely my dumb sexism? I know I should probably be asking Alice, but
I mean, you should ask Alice because she's been to more poetry readings than I have.
that's true.
But I mean, a lot of what you're saying seems very like basic sociology, in that we all know that like our society, in its very limited gendering throughout all culture, does promote men to be sort of assertive, thrusting themselves onto things, and attempts to sort of project the image of the more passive, absorbent woman. I mean, this is very very basic gender politics, isn't it? I'm
Yeah,
pretty
yeah.
saying like the simplistic things here, but I think I mean this is true, and this definitely accounts for your the poetry reading. I
Mhm.
can't speak very much for poetry readings. Last poetry reading I went to was so hideous that I left like in a feeling of utter
You
desolation.
made you made no distinctions between the sexes.
No,
This
they
is
were
not what you were
all they
concerned.
were all awful. Well,
Yeah.
actually, there were two women there. Actually, no, the women seemed to have more to say than the men, mainly because the women's poetry was like either feminist, or I think there was like one non-white person there, and like she read a poem about like being a brown girl in London, which was just kind of awkward because she was the only non-white person there, just talking to like a whole like poppy field of white faces who were sort of cringingly clapping afterwards, and but and like her poem and the other women's poems weren't superior; they were all awful.
Right.
But the feminist poem and the poem about being a brown girl in London were at least interesting, while the
Right.
men had just sort of a massive masturbatory cobbled images thrown together that meant very little, or nothing in themselves, and meant very little connected together. Or wrote poems that, like, they said, "This is one of my secrets about war," and then just wrote like a poem that like could easily boil down to war is bad, and was written by someone who was like using every fucking word in the thesaurus they could lay their hands on. So yeah, I left that poetry reading in like utter despair. And then I went to a concert, and I heard like these brilliantly talented pianists playing. I think well they were playing Wagner actually. They were playing some different opera preludes, and one of them was the prelude from Tristan and Isolde, which is like
Oh yeah.
one of like my favorite pieces of music ever. It's just momentous. And I just thought,
Yeah.
what if at open mics people, instead of sort of masturbating their own work into the ears of the audience, actually stop and read other people's poems, and maybe once in a while read one of theirs. But this seems a very faint hope. But like
Yeah.
getting back to your women thing, I think I don't know. It seems very basic sociology, and but just better trained by our by our. And I'm sorry if I upset any of your sort of conservative Christians, but by our fundamentally patriarchal like structure to
Yeah. Yeah.
be more assertive and dominant. So it doesn't strike me as that strange that they're going to exploit their poetry readings or women in like surrounded continuously in a culture where women are not supposed to be assertive or dominant,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it is changing slightly, but cultural power is very very fundamental and instinctual and sort of just sticky. It sticks.
Yeah.
It doesn't surprise me that much what you're
Well,
outlining.
and you know what I should say, because it was a strong counter example to my observation is the keynote reading at the ALSCW conference I went to in October, I think, in New Haven. I don't know. I don't know if I told you, but the keynote poetry reading was given by Ishian Hutchinson. Um,
Oh, really?
yeah,
Really? Tell me about
and
it.
well,
Is he a bad reader? I've heard some of his readings, and I'm not sold on his reading.
impossible to follow. He mumbled into the mic. He stared. I mean, granted, I think he was in the middle of a long room facing the short wall. So it was like a bad acoustical setup. But he jumped in, plowed through his poems, didn't, I mean, again, I don't want to blame him for bad audio or bad acoustics, but like something that I kept thinking during this reading is like, if you're going to give a reading, first confirm that the audience can hear you. Like, don't proceed if you don't know whether they can hear you.
Yeah, of
Because
course.
so much, like, there's so many of the readings that were like,
Yeah.
people just kept pushing through. And I was like, well, but we're just not getting any of this.
Mm.
Like,
I
you're
mean,
not reading, go
Jeffrey
ahead.
Hill Jeffrey Hill comically breaks off every like 10 minutes in his lectures to say, "Can everyone hear me at the back?"
Right.
And
But
it's amazing. But
that's
yeah, yeah, yeah.
correct. Like, you need to do that. Ishin Hutchinson his voice sounded nice. The sound of his voice was nice. He was very photogenic, like very like striking, like convincingly poetic. Like he looked like a fashion model. I mean, really, like he looked like you'd be in a print campaign, like the back pages of Vanity Fair, the New Yorker or something. And like I read some of the poems later on the page, and they were, again, like, it's not my cup of tea, but like, rich stuff, but no, totally impossible to follow. Mumbled into the mic, staring down, and just pushed through as quick as he could. So
Well,
yeah,
I say this into my sort of bad microphone connected to my technology that does not allow for clarity whatsoever. But from the readings I've heard of Ishton Hutchinson, he's never struck me as a very good performer. He's a
yeah,
tremendously
yeah, yeah.
talented artist. It's probably the closest we have after maybe Jay Wright to being like a great living poet. But I think he's not a good reader. Did
And what
when
he
you
should
read?
do is, like, we should have poets like that go to a reading, be there, and then
Give his
have
work to someone else. Yeah.
have the audiobook guy read it. Have like somebody who's a great
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
reader
Yeah.
read the poems. That's how you should do it. Just like the pianist, the musicians you went to, like, they didn't write Tristan and Isolde.
On a side note, when you read the Hutchinson's poems, could you see how exquisite an artist he was on the page?
Yeah, I mean, again, I have in response to I have the same response to his poetry that I do to a lot of the poetry you and Shane are really into, which is like, this is smart, it's rich. I see that I could mine observations out of this a lot, and I definitely think that not very many people could write like this, but it doesn't grab me. I don't really especially hear a human voice. I'm not swept up by any feeling. There's not a sense of like some essential human experience that is being echoed or reflected or touched on. Again, like, it is very impressive and just not moving at all, and for that reason, not really interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean this is fair enough. I think like while you walk around the monument and admire it from outside, I don't really see it as a monument. I see it as sort of like a living force that I inhabit, and I guess that's the differences to our understandings of like a poetry like Hutchinson's. But I mean, one of the saddest things I think about Hutchinson's reading is that he tends to miss his own rhythms that he's created so exquisitely in the poems themselves. In his sort of obsession with stressing every word, he loses complete control of the free verse rhythms that he quite brilliantly cements into the structure. More and more I'm impressed by free verse poets because more and more I find myself struggling with free verse.
Oh, it's
I find
fucking hard.
I find prose poetry easier than free verse now. Meter and prose is what I'm like most obsessed with, but free verse seems to me so far removed. But I mean, yeah, Hutchinson is exquisite on the page and a great rhythmicist, but not when he reads them out,
So
unfortunately.
just to clarify, because you said, while I'm walking outside the monument, you're existing in it as a living thing. It's a sort of like coral that's alive versus coral that's sort of, the skeleton of
Yeah,
coral.
yeah,
uh and people have made similar observations about like myth. Like, myth is when only the bones are left, right? Like, it's a living culture and religion and experience, while people sort of still are fully invested in it, and it's only
yeah.
later that the myth is what remains.
I'm not sure that's what I was getting at. I was more getting
No,
at the
no, no, no.
differences in our perceptions of like a work like that.
Well, so, but I guess what I'm curious to how you mean that like you're living in it and you're inside it in a way. Does that have to do with the nature of experience? Does that have to do with like the qualities that you're interested? Like, what is it that makes that distinction, do you think?
Elijah wrote to me recently and said I seem to have a very sensual approach to language.
Sorry,
And
who
I
did?
think, sorry, Elijah wrote
Oh,
to me
Elijah. Yeah,
recently.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Elijah wrote to me recently and said I had a very sensual approach to language. And I think this is true. And I think maybe I mean, you maybe have a sensual approach to language, but your sensuality seems very different from mine. And where, like, for a writer like Hutchinson, there is something essentially cold for him, for you. Like, he's sort of a cold but very graceful and sort of very
Yeah,
well designed structure that you find architecturally pleasing, but ultimately cold and unsatisfying.
yeah.
I find sort of a deep, sensual life to the language where I can almost feel possessed. I mean, been reading a lot of Clarice Lispector, who's sort of a Brazilian novelist, a great prose writer. I think she's one of the writers who really transcends whether, like, at the point of writing in poetry or prose. She seems to be just to be writing on like the edge of language, to my
Okay.
mind. But she talks, and her followers like to talk about how she possesses them, or like when reading her, she takes them over to an extent, or her work takes them over. And I think this is true for me for all good writing that I encounter, in that I sort of enter into the work. I'm sucked into it like it's a structure almost, and I sort of move amongst it. But it also moves in me, and it stirs me in an emotional sense. And I think I can get that even from like the pleasure of a phrasing, while maybe you can't quite get that same thing from the same stimuli as I can.
So it's, I mean, it's a difference in like aesthetic.
I think it's a difference in apprehension, isn't it? Or a difference in sensation towards the language itself, and what
Yeah,
charge
yeah,
I
yeah.
can detect and feel, and what charge you can detect and feel, and how that affects us, how we feel the charge. One of my big criticisms of Elijah's approach, especially when it comes to rationality, is that I often feel with people like Ivor Winters, is that they have sort of the Wittgensteinian like logical syllogisms
So,
down to
yeah, yeah.
sort of down, yeah, down perfectly, but they've lost sort of the intellectually feeling intelligence that I think
Yeah.
a lot of poetry animates. You can have essential attitudes towards language without losing any intellectual sort of grasp. In fact, you can place that emotional sensuality into the intellectual reasoning critical consciousness and not lose anything. But I think Ivor Winters loses the sensuality when and focuses too much upon sort of the intellectual regard. And I find it
Okay.
like it's interesting that you compare him to Wittgenstein in the Tractatus. But one of
Yeah.
the most fascinating things about Wittgenstein is that as much as he would describe language as a system of logic, and at least in the Tractatus, and then of course in philosophical investigations, he changed his stance. He never, and made it a policy to never define literature. He saw literature as a way out of the logical
Yeah,
impasse
yeah, yeah.
that like true rhetoric leads us into. So for Wittgenstein, the whole Ivor Winters case would be utterly meaningless because Ivor Winters is attempting to apply logical stimuli to something that should basically be beyond rational understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I am a like claims about how it's impossible to define or it's like a bad idea to define or, I think that's where it really does make a difference whether you're speaking prescriptively or descriptively. Because I think it is still maybe useful to occasionally apply a descriptive lens to things like it's worth at least trying to account for what you can observe. Like, what do
Oh
we
yeah,
talk about when we talk
yeah,
about literature? But I think, but what you're right about is like Winters is completely working in prescriptive terms. He's interested in like identifying
yeah.
what should be allowed to be called literature, what should how we should be writing poetry, what should be the case for poetry, and that, I think that Elijah, though I he took me to task for some insufficiently nuanced characterizations I'd made of him. I think he is, he's a very he's very much a humanist and is not as severe in his actual practice as a reader and writer and even thinker as I think sometimes characterizations of his opinions might suggest. But he is a prescriptivist. He is interested in applying the word should to poetry, and I think that's mostly just a fool's errand.
I mean, Elijah is the most perfect embodiment of sort of Samuel Johnsonism that I've found. I think I'm a sort of post-Wordsworthian writer, and you seem to be more an Aristotelian writer. But I think Elijah is sort of he's very much the Johnsonian pre-Wordsworth vision of literature, and it's quite beautiful to have, I guess, like the two of you together because it's nice to see how you mesh and how you don't quite mesh. But I
Give
guess I
I
have
don't
more
I don't
Wordsworthian certainty more.
I don't need this characterization because I, of course, perfectly understand all your references and I have an encyclopedic knowledge of the history of thought and literature. But just for all of those others in the audience, would you explain what you mean by those comparisons?
Sure. I think I'm kind of maybe badly riffing off Harold Bloom's division of literature in the Western canon, which is maybe one of the most flawed, amusing, terrible, and brilliant books I've ever read.
Mm-hmm.
In that, if you cut out everything when you cut out everything he's talking about, ranting about the feminists and the post-colonials and the Marxists destroying literature. If you cut that all out, you're a much less funny book. But if you pay attention to the things that aren't those things, you also
Yeah.
have a very brilliant book. And he defines that, I can't remember the exact categories he divides it into. But he divides it into different ages. One of these ages is sort of the age of literature focused on the gods, and then this is like the quintessentially Homeric age where the heroes
Yeah.
operate, but there's also much attention to the gods. The ancient Greek tragedians, I think, mark the edge of that age, and then he doesn't seem very particularly interested in the Latin writers, but I imagine they sort of have a strange intersection. And then he talks about so that age is called the theocratic age. So there's much sort of focus on religion, right? Then he talks about the aristocratic age. This is sort of the age of Johnson, the metaphysicals, Goethe. Is it Goethe? Goethe.
Goethe?
Yeah, Goethe. Goethe is sort of the edge of it. And then he has sort of the democratic age, which is marked by Wordsworth. And of course, Wordsworth is a revolutionary writer even now. I've been rereading Wordsworth. I think Wordsworth, everyone misunderstands Wordsworth. If you want to understand Wordsworth, you should read John Ashbery and then read Wordsworth again. Because Wordsworth is like shockingly like John Ashbery, I think, in like so many ways. But Wordsworth redefines poetry because he basically turns the poetic perception upon the mind, upon the thing making poetry. I guess I'm kind of coming from that tradition, and I think the big thing is you and Elijah would disagree with me when I'd say like every poem is an ars poetica at some degree, and I think you and Elijah have a kind of a pushback against this, and I think that's because you're basically pre the democratic age. Maybe I'm wrong to say that you're from the theocratic age, and I think I brought in Aristotle a little bit randomly because I can't really remember what Bloom says about Aristotle. But you seem very close to Aristotle in his poetics, right? From what I can remember of what Aristotle says. Maybe more so close to Aristotle than you are to, I don't know, Plato. But I don't really know if any critic's close to Plato, because if you're close to Plato, you wouldn't like poetry anyway.
I mean, I need to read a lot more to have to be able to make a thorough scholarly response to what you're saying. But it is making me think about this question that I've had kind of unresolved for a while about reading. So do you know I want to say it's like coder slang, this term kludge?
Kludge? No.
Kludge.
What?
I believe it's spelled KLUDGE, kludge.
Wait, can we pause a minute? Because I just want to go to the toilet quickly. Can
Yeah,
you
go. Yeah.
fill the time? Tell the listeners about something else for a second. Okay, I'll be back.
It was a great this past weekend. It was the day I flew home, I think, from Newburyport was the day the new world chess champion was decided. So it was sort of a fascinating saga. So 2 world chess championships ago. So for 10 years, Magnus Carlsen was the world chess champion. He's totally dominant chess player, like a good 50 to 70 points higher in chess rating than the next highest, great chess player alive. So he is still considered the best chess player alive. But not this most recent chess championship, and not the one before that, but the one before that, he played against Fabiano Caruana, who is one of the 2 best American chess players alive, and they played 14 classical games. That's 2 hours for the first 40 moves, and just colossal games. They can go on almost indefinitely if they get to a high enough number of moves. He played 14 games against Caruana in a row, and they drew all of them. All of them were ties. And then they went into rapid tiebreakers. And in the rapid games, this was just 25 minutes a game with a time increment. In that competition, Carlsen won. So then the most recent, and then after that, he played Jan Nepomniachtchi, who's the top Russian player in the world right now. I mean, a lot of great Russian players. The Russians have long dominated chess, but he played Jan Nepomniachtchi, and they were drawn for the first 5 games, and it looked to be a repeat of the match with Caruana. And then the 6th game, as I think I mentioned with Brian, Carlsen, who's famously very physically fit, played a 7.5-hour game against Nepomniachtchi, who is brilliant but very out of shape. And Nepomniachtchi was just completely worn out by the end, and he finally made a mistake, and Carlsen just chipped away at him until there was nothing left. So he is, Carlsen is a great player who can play a lot of different styles, but when he plays at the highest level, he is famous for just being. There was Karpov, I think, was a Russian player who was known as the boa constrictor, because he would find a tiny edge and then just slowly squeeze the life out of his opponent. And Carlsen does something very much like that, where he's good at insanely long end games with like a rook and a king versus a bishop, a knight, and a king, or something like this. So he's just good at these sort of brutal wars of attrition. And after that game, Nepomniachtchi sort of broke, and he lost several other games. He kind of fell apart. He then won the candidates tournament after that, and so it was going to be another match with Nepomniachtchi against Carlsen, and Carlsen said, no thanks. He said, I will decline to defend my title. So he's still, without dispute, the best chess player in the world. But he just said, I don't want to play another match against Nepomniachtchi. He also said, I think tellingly, it just won't be very fun. And he didn't just mean for himself. He meant as a spectator sport. He's a huge sports fan. And as he observed, it's really weird to have a reigning chess world champion, right? You will have a reigning boxing champion, but you lose that championship with one boxing match, right? You lose one fight and you're no longer the champion. And then you can get it back by winning one fight. But having these enormous, onerous matches in which you have a reigning champion, particularly when you have a player as dominant as Carlsen or Kasparov in a previous generation, it actually makes for boring chess, right? Like the matches against Caruana and Nepomniachtchi were chess at the very highest level, but it's not very fun at the very highest level, to be honest. Like, it's fun when it's played when it's a little messier. So because he declined to defend his position, Nepomniachtchi played Ding Liren, who's the best Chinese player who's ever lived. And it was a fucking amazing match. I mean, just a slugfest. Both of them are very emotional players. At one point, Ding Liren's prep got leaked. That is, he's a notoriously meticulous player who often runs into time trouble because he takes so long. He's so well prepared and he takes so long calculating his moves. He sometimes runs out of time. And he got preparation help from Richard Rapport, who's a Hungarian player who's famously very unpredictable. He plays these wild, strange games. He's inspired by Mikhail Tal, who's a famous one-time world chess champion who is he's not the strongest overall player, but he did a thing. There's a great line from Tal. He said, you must take your opponent into a deep, dark forest where 2 + 2 = 5, and the path leading out is only wide enough for one. And that, though nobody cited Tal in the commentary for this championship, that line got referred to often because people kept referring to the dark forest that one player was leading the other into. And often this was Nepomniachtchi leading Ding into a deep, dark forest, meaning that he wasn't necessarily playing what the computer would call the best moves, but he was playing moves that was hard to figure out. And so he actually won a game against Ding by slowly making his own position worse and worse and worse, while making Ding calculate longer and longer and longer in order to figure out what was going on until he finally had a nervous breakdown and froze and ran out of time, which really doesn't happen at the highest level, not in classical games. But they went back and forth. They both had, serious emotional distress. They were passionate. The Ding finally won the whole match in the last rapid tiebreak game with a really stunning move. And it was a game that was drawn. All of the commentators, Caruana himself said this is definitely a drawn game. And then Ding played what might have seemed like a suicidal move, pinning his own rook on Nepomniachtchi's king or queen, and throwing away what would have been a safe draw with the black pieces to go for broke and try to win. And he did. It was a really daring and sort of like stunning decision. These were not games played by the computerized book. These were games played between live competitors to see who could win the World Series this year. Now, Ding is going to maintain, he's going to keep his title for the next year, but even he in the press conference said, someone said, did you ever dream of being world chess champion? Or he said, when did you first dream of being the world chess champion? And he said, never. I never dreamed of that. I dreamed of being the best. And so I think in a weird way, we have Carlsen to thank for not competing and for letting this be more of a live fight. It was fascinating to watch. I have lots of other thoughts about like the intricacies of how chess is commented upon, but it was a lot of fun. Like, I'm not a big sports fan, but I thought like this was an instance where I thought like you get the wisdom of the way a lot of sports competitions are structured. And congrats to Ding. And boy, Nepomniachtchi losing the world chess champion twice in a row, given how long it takes, how difficult it is to get to qualify. Ding automatically qualifies next year. It's so onerous to get to qualify as the challenger. So Nepomniachtchi, I totally sympathize with him. I think he is, he's a genius and I'm not. But like, I sympathize with his persona as a chess player because he's incredibly broody and self-destructive and impulsive, but also quite brilliant. So sans brilliance, I sympathize with. I relate to. Maybe as Elijah would say, I sympathize and empathize with Nepomniachtchi. But it was fascinating to watch, and I can't recommend enough going back and just even when I went back and I rewatched like the games that were already drawn and I already knew they were drawn just to see what happened along the way. It is very much like the obsession that one falls into trying to write a poem. Nothing will happen for 30 minutes, but a lot of chewing is happening. And it's pretty fascinating to watch. All right, I think Cameron's back from the bathroom and he's just listening to me ramble about fucking chess. So, all right, Cameron, please come back and save the listeners from all of my chess bullshit.
Oh, it was fun. You're a very talented monologuist, which you do a podcast, so you should be.
Good. Happily. All right. What less obscure topic were we dealing? What less obscure poetry related topic were we dealing with?
Well, it was obscure to me. We were talking about Kludge.
Kludge. Yeah. All right.
Kludge?
So I think this is I first heard of it from a computer coder. I believe that's where it comes from. I'm not sure. I've also heard some people pronounce it Kluge, which just seems like phonetically wrong to me if it's spelled that way. But so a kludge is a solution that does perform the task required, but doesn't do so using the sort of the correct and most efficient available tools. So
okay.
Like with computer coding, there are, in the same way that like mathematicians talk about like beautiful proofs, there are very elegant there's very elegant code and there's also very inelegant code. And partly this is because it's like it's possible to solve the same problem a bunch of different ways, but some of them you'll solve them the way like there were no blinds in the room I stayed in at my brother's house. In the room I was in, it was the sun was coming through the window, so I took the modesty curtain from their bathroom and stretched out the suspension bar and got an empty box of Kleenex and created a wedge in the door in the window and then propped it up using some boxes from the room and a roll of toilet paper in order to sort of partially blot out the sun from the window. That's a kludge, right? It does the same thing as like a proper set of curtains, but it's much uglier and cruder and less efficient. I remember doing in grade school, we had a computer coding class, very briefly, wonderful class, quickly abandoned for typing class, which I guess I'm glad because I use typing a lot more than I use coding. But I was supposed to program a little toy traffic light to run red, green, yellow in order, and for like reasonable lengths of time, with the yellow being very short and the red and the green being the same length of time.
That's all. That's all you had to do. We had to
No.
program
This
video.
was like a one time assignment. It was like
Oh,
one
okay.
day of class when I was
Oh, okay. Okay.
probably second grade, third grade. It was
Right.
fun. It was like little like
Yeah.
Legos basically.
But you
And
did the
I
clutch strategy.
Well, so it turned out that the way you're supposed to do it is you're supposed to tell the light to turn on this color for a certain length of time and then turn it off. And when it turns that off, the next color knows to turn on. And then it's sort of if, then, when this, then that. And you set it up to kind of do the sequence. So it's playing all these lights in a row. I didn't do that. I made it do 3 separate sequences in parallel where I told the green light to be on for a certain period of time and then off for a certain period of time. And then I timed out the red and the yellow to do the same so that they would never be on at the same time and they would come on in sequence, but they were all operating independently of each other. I just did it with like
That's quite clever.
I
That's
I
quite
mean, it's
clever way.
fine. Yeah, it's much messier and it took a lot more, programming to do
Hmm.
it. It was much less elegant, but it was like that was my first. I didn't know the word kludge then, but that was my introduction to the concept. When
Right.
I
Yeah. Yeah.
brought in my showed my work, and the teacher said, "This is not how you were supposed to do this at all. It's completely
Yeah.
wrong. It looks identical, but it's completely wrong." Uh,
Does this relate to poetry? Come
Eventually,
undone.
yeah. So the I have had this. I've long had this feeling that when we talk about reading, we're really talking about different things. Like there's like a very basic like we've talked about colors and sort of the hailstones and hollow bones thing, but like a very like dumb obvious like freshman philosophy question is like, but do you, when you see this color, is it the same thing that I'm experiencing? Like, well, who knows, maybe it's not, maybe this and that. And like there's plenty has been said about that, but I have always really felt this way about reading. Like the way other people seem to read or talk about reading often makes me feel like we're getting kind of the same results, but like I don't know. I really don't think we're doing the same things. And there was an interesting thing I heard. It was John McWhorter, who's I think he's best known now as like a political contrarian, but he's I think by training he's a linguist, and he had this observation about an educational controversy where, and this is I think now back in the news again, where like one basic approach to teaching kids how to read is you teach them that certain letters and letter combinations make certain sounds. And of course, in English, it's extremely inconsistent, and you have to teach them a gajillion, exceptions. But basically, you teach them like what sounds the letters make, and you teach them how to sound out words, and then they eventually sort of learn how to read words with and read, and like make allowances for various exceptions, and so on. And it's very messy, but that's sort of one standard way to teach kids how to read. Another way, which gained popularity for a long time, is to let the kids just recognize the whole word. I think it's called whole word reading, where you show that you don't say like, well, a makes the sound, but sometimes it makes this sound and sometimes it makes that sound. But in this case, we say a p p l e apple. Instead, you just show them a p p l e and you say this is apple, and then eventually they learn that. And then you show them other words and they eventually learn the whole word at once, and that way they're not having to deal with spelling exceptions. They're just learning each word as a whole thing on its own. And this is another strategy, and for a long time this has been and like the way to do this is also much less methodical. It's much more about just exposing kids to reading. And the controversy is that it doesn't seem to work as well as teaching phonics. Like the results seem to be that like kids don't learn to read as well. And the observation McWhorter made, which I don't know if this is true. I'm not a neurologist, I'm not a linguist, whatever. But he said this thing, which like whether or not the thing he said is at all true, I think a version of it is true. Even if it, even like forgetting this case, I think like in general, the phenomenon he describes is has some parallel in reality. So he said that basically there's a linguistic portion, there's a portion of our brain that's like well adapted to learning language. And when you learn phonics, you are basically like you are training this part of your mind to process, visual cues or, tangible cues and link them to certain sounds and link them to, and then build up words out of that sort of messy and shifting vocabulary of sounds. And your brain is sort of well adapted to do that, and and then continue to learn from there. And at a certain point, you get pretty good at like reading words you haven't seen before because you've seen words that are like them. Now he said, by contrast, when you memorize whole words, you're actually using a different part of your brain, and you are filing away sort of whole chunks of fact in this sort of memorization portion of your brain. And then what happens is at a certain point, you hit a kind of a capacity, and you might have the same results basically for a certain way, but ultimately you're going to have a much less flexible. Your mind, the way it's been trained to read, is going to be a lot worse at. It's going to be less supple, and it's going to be worse at learning new things about reading, new words, and more difficult texts. Now, again, I don't know if the things he's saying about parts of your brain and hitting capacity, I don't know if any of that's true, and I certainly don't know if it's relevant to this particular problem. But what it made me think is that like our brains are sophisticated and complex and messy enough, and they also are really good at learning. Like your brain is really good at learning things according to how you use it. And so it just made me think that like reading is a weird enough thing that I feel like the chances are really good that many of us are coming up with these sort of different, slightly kludgy ways to do the thing. And so we might get similar results and we're able to communicate, but I suspect that like in some cases you have a simple pattern turning the lights on and off in sequence because they're responding to each other. And in others, you have these people running these big, messy parallel systems. And I suspect that at a certain point, when you're dealing with like, compared to people who don't care about poetry at all, you and I are much more similar in our tastes. But when you're getting down to like a really fine granular level and dealing with poetry in sort of at the extremes, then maybe that's a place where like the slight differences in how I've built my own inner engine of reading start to really matter. And there's certain things that I'm going to respond to a lot more than others. I suspect that what it means that you're able to take the kind of pleasure you take in poetry like Hutchinson's, I suspect that people like you and Shane and Ryan have actually built sort of better internal engines for reading. And it's just like I basically like, I think that at a certain point it's probably not merely that like I think I can grow and change, but I think it's not merely that like you say potato, I say potato, or like I'm kind of into this, or I've spent a little more time with that. I think there might be a different mechanism at work internally when you read. And I think like everybody may be a little different, but I tend to think that there are probably some categories of this. Like some people tend to use one set of tools more than others. Does any of this make sense?
I do wonder. I wonder how much it comes down to formative experiences, how much the engine is formed early on. I know I like when I read the anthologies of poems that I had in school, I remember feeling great dissatisfaction with how the language was used. And I do wonder
Mm.
if this still influences my interest in language now. But I also think like I don't know, the engines are very complex and variegated because
Yeah.
there's an extreme of poetry that I just find utterly that disinteresting. You had your guest on talking about unreadability. I
Yeah.
can't
Yeah.
remember
Yeah.
his
Yeah.
name. I just find that so uninteresting. I find, I don't find the idea that a poem is actually unreadable. I just think, what's the point? It just seems utterly, I don't know, reductive. And there are poets that I find just unreadable like, I don't know, J.H. Prynne or the language poets who seem pointless to an extent, but their unreadability seems an armor shielding a crucial absence.
Mm.
So I do think my engine is very sort of specifically tuned. You're probably
Yeah.
right in that I may have a closer and definitely a closer ending to Shane and even to Ryan and maybe even to Elijah in some ways than yours is. But
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. You seem to be on the right track. And obviously the brain is one of the most, I don't know if it's a cliche, if it's a cliche truism, or if it's just a cliched fictionality, but I'm pretty sure, everyone says the brain is the most complex organism we know in nature. So
Yeah, organic
it's,
structure, certainly. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So this seems unsurprising.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's right. And Elijah, I don't know. It's funny because I mean, you and he are similar in some ways, but he also is like he is really interested in the thought and the argument of the poem to a degree that it almost feels to me like I need there to be a little more sense of voice, a little more sense of like a human mind trying to put things into words for somebody theoretically to hear. I seem to need that more than you do, but then he needs this like voice to be like speaking a coherent and like independently compelling argument that is logically coherent and consistent in a way that like some of the poems he likes best I find very dry, and like it's not that I can't follow them, it's just that they're like making abstract claims that it's just feels like they're very far from the the fluidity and the felt magic and the caprice of poetry I love. And then for you, it feels like it's like there's a spectrum that goes even further, where you're sort of able to take pleasure even beyond a sense that this is like a persona speaking in some kind of condition. So I mean, to me, I intuitively I place myself somewhere between the two of you on a spectrum, I'm sure that there's more than one spectrum, and maybe it's a circle.
Yeah, maybe it's a circle. I think also to like take Milton's free, Milton says a poem should be simple, sensuous, and passionate. And
Mm.
to take each of those claims and sort of blow them out to almost beyond their like typified meaning.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah,
sort of where Elijah stands is on the simple side. Not that he wants poems to be simple, but he wants poems to be to communicate concepts with clarity, right?
yeah,
This
yeah.
is a very big part of Elijah's thought. While you stand more on the passionate side, in that you want
Right.
poems to communicate concepts emotionally and in a sort of embodied human way. And
Yeah,
maybe where I stand on the sensuous side, where I want emotions that are poems to communicate in the very shape, form, and atmospherics of their language as much as in the meaning. Or I think I want the meaning and the language to become the same thing. I don't want them to be separated. So
right.
I think
Yeah, yeah,
maybe we
yeah.
all stand slightly differently until the Miltonic triad. If
That's
I
pretty, yeah, that's pretty good actually. Simple, sensuous, and passionate as these three.
but also
Yeah.
I had to deform the meaning of each of those words to get at
Right.
what
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
we're
yeah.
getting at. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that might be helpful.
No, that's it's almost like we're like Elijah here. We almost it's like we scripted this, or at least you did. All right, last thoughts, last words. Do you want to redo the outro?
Sure, we can redo the outro. Remind me what we say in the outro again,
We
and I can try
say
and do it.
that's
We
this
say,
week's show.
well, that was this week's show. I hope you all enjoyed it. You can find me, Cameron, at CameronWTC at hotmail.com. And where can people find you, Matthew?
SLEERICKETS@gmail.com.
I hope you all enjoyed, and we will hopefully be back to talk to you very soon.
Close paraphrase. That's good. That's actually so you I
My
fucked up because you were
That's
trying
my
to
own
do it.
style.
You were doing it really professionally this time for once, and I fucked it up. But that was good. I think that'll do. That's good.
Yeah, yeah.
And paraphrase very soon. Until then.